So I'm going to take you in this idea, which is beat the Reaper, and explain why we're actually giving this class a couple weeks before Pesach and not why we're talking about Passover and so on. But it's going to be an aerial view. And I've broken it down into a few sections, which I'll just give you the headlines so you can time when you want to fall asleep in the class. It's a little easier that way. So we have, I think, there's 7 sections. It's going to be who are we up against, who is the angel of death, what is the death process, coming into the next world, do the dead really care about the living, Judgment Day, kind of important one, maybe don't fall asleep for that one. It's good to be like I always found if I prepare for a test, I do better. So has anyone come back to tell us about life after death, and then the conclusion. So that's kind of what the aerial view is going to be. And I'll just start off with why are we talking a little bit about this now, Erev Pesach, because the fact of the matter is that Chazal tell us, our sages tell us, there is no greater form of illusion than death. Because there was never supposed to be death. Death was not part of plan A. Death is part of plan B. Death was the choice that Adam chose. And therefore, on a very deep level, even though Adam chose that OS, that operating circuit, which is the basic level of death, and that became life as we know it, still, it cannot undermine the will of God. And therefore, within the will of God, there is no death. Because the concept of life is not merely a tree functioning through a xylem and phloem, or a man or human functioning through respiratory system. This is how we live. But why we live is only, and it's across the board, because God desires it to exist. Therefore, in Kabbalah, Yismak Moshe, other Svarim, you'll find that in incarnation, which we're not going to go into tonight, but even a stone can be reincarnation of an entity, because everything is living because it's connected to the Ratzon, to the will of God. And therefore, since everything is sustained through the will of God, there cannot be death, because there is no death before Chosh Baruch Hu. So therefore, death is that which we sincerely see and we live and we are in fear of, and all of the rest of that. But nonetheless, on a deep level, and we're going to get to that deep level, God willing, there is no such thing in its ultimate reality. And that which attests in our existence, not in our intellectual, although it impinges or it goes into our intellect, but that which really impacts our soul to understand that there's no death is Kriyat Yam Suf. It's the splitting of the sea. Because the splitting of the sea is all about that everything which is nature's, we know Teva is the Gematria Elokim, that all of nature is manifest in the operating name of God as Elokim, but we know that Hashem Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is the override of Elokim, Hashem Elokeinu, in the end, Hashem Echad. And therefore we know that even though it's all through the world of nature, and that's how these things function, it's secondary to the higher level of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, of that desire of God. And that's why, in fact, even the Gemara, when it asks in Sanhedrin, where are there hints to the resurrection of the dead, one example it brings is because we say it every morning, Oz Yashir, that they will sing. Not that they sang in the past tense, but they will sing in the future. The song that they sang is not the song that we're singing. The song that they sang was the first time the song was sung, but it's being sung throughout all generations. Elavakol dor vador. In every generation, we are part of this movement through history from coming out of Egypt, going into the Garden of Eden. And only once we get to the Garden of Eden, Olam Haba, in this world, did we then really, when Moshe Rabbeinu is back from the dead, will he then lead that chorus, Az Yoshir. Then Moshe will actually lead that singing. This is hinted at because we know again from the Gemara that the stempel, the signature of God in this world is Emet, is truth. And we see also the Gemara in Tainus says that Yaakov lo mate. Jacob didn't die, and we also know that Jacob, Vatitain Emet liYaakov. Because Yaakov is Emet, he didn't die. What's the correlation? Well, the 3 letters are the 3 parts of a person. Working backwards, the letter Tuf is Torah, and that's the Sichli, as the Maharal refers to. That's the spiritual understanding, the cognitive intelligence of who a person is. The Mem is Mitzvah, that relates to the body, right? The Torah is the soul of the person, the Mem is the Mitzvah, is the body. And the body and the soul are only alive through the ahava, the aleph, the oneness of a person in their heart. V'ahavta Hashem, v'ahavta l'recho chomocha, v'ahavta et hager, v'ahavta et haaretz. All of these aspects of love, that oneness, ahava being gematria 13, which is echad. So all of that is together emet. This is why, even if a person on the outside might have the most religious-looking decor and have a tremendous amount of Torah wisdom and unbelievable performance of mitzvot and all of the rest of that, but they are without that actual chibur, that connection of aleph to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then without that aleph, met. That's death. So therefore, the only thing which actually keeps us alive and will keep us alive, as we'll see as we get now into the actual class, is that connection to the aleph. And that's the connection also, which is on one line. I'll just teach one more idea from the Arizal, which will tie Pesach, and that'll be the doorway into the class itself. We know that when Moshe comes to Paro, the Arizal points out that Pharaoh is Pe-Ra, is how you spell the name. Pe is the mouth, Ra, the evil mouth, or the foul mouth. And what does that mean that he's the foul mouth? Well, because Paro was God, right? That was the whole idea when God says to Moshe, he says, Moshe, go down to the river at 4:55 because Paro, who never goes to the bathroom, at 5 o'clock he's zipping down into the reeds, and while all of Alexandria, wherever the capital is, are sound asleep, he's like, right? So Pharaoh's running down, and Moshe Rabbeinu pops out from behind the bush, and this is probably where the U.S. Congress gets the concept of filibuster from. And Moshe's going, oh great God, who never goes to the bathroom anywhere, even in the Nile, right? And so on and so on. And of course you can imagine Pharaoh first thing in the morning, men could probably relate to this more, hopping from leg to leg, and he's going, yo Moshe, like what? And Moshe says, let my people go. And he said, I'll make a deal, let me go, and I'll let you go, right? So that was like what was going on back and forth, because like I say, when we lived in Egypt, we lived in denial. So Pharaoh lives in denial because he portrays himself as God. Moshe, on the other hand, portrays himself as humble, as a soul. And this is why when Moshe wants the soul free himself from the ego of ourselves, because what is Paro? He is the king of Mitzrayim. Mitzarim, tsuris, from a world of an uptight personality. This is how you can tell where a person's spiritual evolution is the way they articulate, the way they speak, the kindness in their words, or the, God forbid, vulgar language, or their anger. All of these things are indicators of a person's spirituality. So therefore, Moshe comes up against Paro, and at the end of Moshe's life, he dies on Har Nebo. Nebo is also, the Arizal plays with it and says, Nun Ba. He came to Nun. He came to the 50th gate of wisdom. So Moshe, at the end of his life, reaches the 50th gate of wisdom. The letters Moshe with Nun spell the word Neshama, also the word Mishnah Torah. And so therefore Moshe reaches the pinnacle of the soul's ability to connect to the infinite. And where does he go from there? He now, being able to reach the highest level, hands it to his student, Yeshua bin Nun, the student of the Nun. So he's now able to take the Nun and bring the Yeshua, the redemption, into the world by bringing HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Ratzon into the physical Eretz Yisrael. So that's another class. But that is what the whole idea of Passover is. To fight the foul mouth, we fight it with a Pesach, the speaking mouth. And so therefore we begin to communicate. We know that there are 3 levels of speech. The simplest form is Sicha, Altir Sicha, right? That Sicha is the simplest form. That's Pesach. The mouth begins to talk. And then once we come out of talking, now all of a sudden what we do is we break down our world. Suddenly we are free, but free to do what? This begins the counting of the Omer. And again, if you want a source for this, it's Marsha on Brachas. I think it's on either Hey or Yud Amid Bet. But you'll see there about the interchangeability of certain letters. So Omer is with an ayin, is with an aleph, which means to speak. So therefore we go from the level of Sicha to the level of Amirah. Why? Because often when we do self-analysis, we could, God forbid, fall into terrible depression. Oh my gosh, how could I have ever done that? Oh my gosh, why was I like that person? And so therefore, when we're pulling apart the 7 days of time and space, right? That's what the world is created, 7 times 7. Those are the 49 days. That's why after every element of time and space, you go from 49 to the 50th gate of wisdom, which is prophecy. That's Shavuot. So that process of analyzing every aspect of our lives, time and space, about that we have to be loving. Amor, as Rashi says, Amor as opposed to Daber. Daber is Chazak, by Daber Chazak, strong, but Lamor, say it kindly. So when we analyze our life, we have to be loving and forgiving and patient and understand no matter what we've done, we can put it back up on its feet. As long as there's time on the clock, you can still score. And so therefore, that is the lesson that we have, is that process. And once we get that, once we connect now to Emet, which is the giving of Torah, which is Shavuot, we reach the highest form of speech, which is Shavuot, an oath. Because now you can take an oath about what is true, because now it's clear before you. Okay, well, that was clear. Anyhow, so that's sort of like a background and the tie-in to the lesson of Passover and how we now look at this idea of beat the reaper. But before we get really into it, I just do this to give you like a little spice and flavor as to why I love the Chachamim of the Talmud. I mean, I think that the Chachamim of the Talmud, I call them like the Shas Vikings. Like these guys were so real and so alive and so dynamic. I'm afraid that if they were here today, that they might be put in cherem. But in those days, they were what Judaism was really all about, and it's extraordinary. I mean, I have some of my Haredi grandchildren who only speak Yiddish. Thank God my wife speaks Yiddish, so she told me I only needed like 2 words to relate to them. That was Zadie and Gelt. So now I get along really well with them. But like with them, it's like, it's unbelievable. Clothing is everything. And I said, well, have you ever heard this rabbi called, what's his name? Yeah, Rava? You know, he used to wear a red hat. Okay, but we're not going to go down that path. Anyhow, so, but here are the types of questions that are not to our class, but it's Gemara and Ksuvas. If you want to have sources on everything I use, so I'm happy to give out the Makorot afterwards as well. The Gemara asks, do people age in the grave? I mean, are there birthdays? Is there any point in like going down to the cemetery, like little cake and candles and things like that? The Gemara also asks, can a person wish after they die? Which those of you, I see there's some other dinosaurs here besides just me, so you might remember the reference, will I dream, Dave? Right? In 2001 when they're disconnecting Hal. So will we have the ability to wish after we die? And the Gemara Nida asks, can people speak Lashon Hara about each other, even in Olam Haba? And then, of course, the Gemara Avodah Zarah asks, will man live forever? And it brings the story of 7 people who never died. And interestingly enough, one of the 7, I find this very beautiful, is Eliezer Ev Avraham, who in the famous parsha that's all about Eliezer, right, when he goes to get Rivka, you ever notice his name's not mentioned once? Okay, so the humblest of all the humble, to be a servant. This is the first gra in the Sefer Yeshua. When it introduces Yeshua, it talks about Yeshua as Eved Moshe. And the gra says, why does it call him Talmud? Because what's Talmud? That's nothing. To be an Eved, to serve a great person, to serve greatness, is the highest of the highest. Okay, so let's start with the Malach HaMavis, the angel of death. I always think of, when I begin this, I'm sure some of you probably remember Monty Python, or Monty Python, if he's Jewish, and they had the meaning of life. Remember that scene, The Meaning of Life, where they're like, the Americans are visiting the Brits, and they're in that little home at night, there's a knock at the door, and she opens it, it's like the Grim Reaper, and she said, I'm sorry, who are you? Like, oh, I'm the angel of death. And no one believes him until he like hovers into the middle of the table without the lower half of his body. And whoa, whoa, whoa. Anyhow, long story short, he says, okay, everybody, you're all dead. And the last scene, they're all walking single file after him up into heaven. And the wife yells out, she says, Mr. Death, sir, sorry, but how did we die? And he yells back, the tuna fish. You know, like her husband says, I told you it smelled funny. And the very last scene before, wait, I didn't have any tuna fish. Anyhow, so that's kind of, that's called being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So that's just sort of like a little bit of an image that comes to my mind. But there's a medrash I always found. My Rebbe used to tell in a very cute way. If you're ever in the military and your officer comes out and he's looking for a volunteer, it's usually everybody but one guy who steps backwards. So like Hashem comes out and he says, okay, I need an angel of death. Any volunteers? Everyone's like really quiet. He's like, well, why no volunteers? Listen, who wants to be like the angel of death? You kidding? And God says, what are you talking about? Don't worry. No one will ever blame you. They'll say it was a car accident. They'll say it was this disease. They'll say it was that accident. No, we need a newspaper. 5 people killed by angel of death. Don't worry. No one's ever going to pin it on you. And the truth of the matter is, unlike some of our other people on the planet, their idea of the angel of death is a fallen angel waiting like with some other, Hell's Angel dudes and like some machine guns combusting into the Garden of Eden, right? Okay, God, eat this. That's not Jewish in the least. The Jewish idea actually is the angel of death, as we'll see, is an extremely high-level angel. And the reason the angel of death is so high is because he's on God's side, if you will. In other words, he has a harder time with God's honor, or those that honor God, than simply being as God is, the compassionate one who understands even those who don't honor God, which is kind of the amazingness of like the Gemara says in such a beautiful way, why does stolen wheat grow? Right? It's so anti-God, and yet it grows, because that's God's unbelievable kindness. He funds us. He pours life into us. We can be total like jerkos, and he just loves us no matter what. But that's not the angel of death. Angel of death has a problem with that because he's into Elohim, Midat Hadin. This is the will of God. It's got to be as it happens, and so on. And of course, there is the compassion of death itself. But the thing is, and we see this, that ultimately it's not about evil, God forbid. And we find this because we see the famous Medrash, the Gemara brings it also, that when Moshe Rabbeinu is on Mount Sinai, all the angels are giving him gifts, and the angel of death gives him the gift of the Ketoret, that the incense was what would stop against life and death. As we know later, when Aaron goes out among the plague with the incense, it was Moshe who told him. Rashi brings that Gemara there, and it says because the angel of death told him this. Now why? What was that all about? Because we know, again, Adam was never supposed to die. The only time mankind ever got back to that was at the point in time at Mount Sinai. So at that moment at Mount Sinai, before the golden calf, we had returned to the level of Adam pre-sin. Therefore, there should be no death. Therefore, the angel of death gave over the gift of life, because at that point there should be no more death. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah says it in a very beautiful way, and this is something for us to all think about. It says there is no greater goodness you can bring to this world than a world without death. And what does that mean? I mean, it's really, it's hard for us to imagine. I think this is actually the biggest problem of living, is that we don't really know how awesome we are. We don't really realize that we have superpowers. And these superpowers are the ability to perform the will of God in this world. There's so many other distractions that we have. But if we could somehow ignore those distractions and tune into the glorious opportunity while we're still alive, we can change everything. I mean, it's very hard for us to believe this. In fact, I'll digress for a minute. This Gemara in Sota, the very first daf there, is talking about, actually it's two places, but the one in Sota talks about that is, I'll say it in English, it's difficult for one to find their Besher, I know that's English, right, as their soulmate, as it is to split the Red Sea. Sorry. Kasha Kakriyas Yamsuf, right, to find one, and then in the Gemara, I think in Chulin, it says it again, but about making livelihood or parnasa. So this is a very strange language. What does it mean, difficult to split the Red Sea? I mean, this again, tie back to Passover. What's difficult? What's difficult? Is it difficult for God? Like, was God like holding the Red Sea? Hurry up, Moshe, Zvulun, let's go, move that tribe, move, come on. Right? I can't hold this open too much longer? No, what are you talking about? God was like behind his back, like doing galaxies, little pinky here, split a sea, right? There's like no hard. Was it hard for the Jewish people? No, it was impossible, right? Can you like imagine like Hasidim going down to the Red Sea on Chol Hamoed to ceremoniously try to part the water again? No, you can't do it. So there's no hard, there's no kasher. It's either totally impossible or NBD. So what's kasher? What's hard? So one approach is, it was hard for the Jewish people to believe that God loved us this much, that this is what God would do for us. He would split a sea if that's what it required. That was hard. Because you know why? If you don't really love yourself, two problems. One, you can't love anybody else because you can't give what you don't have. And two, you can't be loved. Because somebody says, I love you, I don't even love me, so how could he or she love me, right? Because obviously they just love the wizard. They don't love the little professor from Kansas behind them, right? So that was a Kansas joke, sorry. So how is it possible that they could say, I love you? They don't even know who I am, right? So what's that all about? So that's the thing. That's the challenge. We have to understand how infinite is God's love for us. That anything can happen. A sea could split. The dead can come back to life. Right? It's one of the 13 principal beliefs of being a Jew. It's not like, as I love when people say, oh yeah, that's a medrash. Oh, what? You know, I mean, the Rebbe Akiva who wrote that medrash is suddenly less significant than the Rebbe Akiva who wrote the Mishnah or whatever. Let's leave that aside. It's a little problem I have with that. Only a medrash. But we believe in the resurrection of the dead. So therefore, there's nothing that can stand before us if we connect to God. That's the incredible insight. That's our amazing power. And that is what the power of the Gemara says. You want to bring a gift into this world? Eradicate death. And the first way is, each of us has to eradicate death within ourselves. Because if we are prisoners of our past, we are partially dead. When we realize that our future is something for us that we can claim, by removing our past, we can actually be alive and not dead. That doesn't mean, God forbid, ignoring the mistakes of the past. Just the opposite. It means turning around and facing the mistakes, addressing the mistakes in a loving way, not a critical way, and then through that do tikkun, through that do tshuva, through that repair and be able to begin again. So the Gemara talks about many, many Rabbanim, I'm not going to take the time right now, who were actually personal friends of the angel of death. Gemara Baba Basra talks about the angel of death actually saving the life of a particular tzaddik. Here's a very cute one. This is Gemara in Baba Basra. It says that Reb Acha Bar Yaakov, one of my heroes in the Amoraim world, you always have to have, like, you know, you play baseball cards, like Mantle, right? So I have like a few Amoraim and Tanoim that kind of like in my own little shelf over there. So he's one of them, definitely. So anyhow, so it says that he was giving a drasha, and he gave a drasha, and he said that the Satan, the devil's real motivation for attacking Job was because he wanted to protect the honor of Avram Avinu. He really didn't have a problem with Job. Job was, according to many opinions, was the same time, Yov was the same time as Avram, and he didn't want, because Yov was such an unbelievable tzaddik, he didn't want Yov's light to impinge on Abraham's light. So the Gemara says that when he gave the drasha, the Satan himself came and kissed the rabbi's feet in gratitude for revealing what his real motivations were. So let's go through the death process. Kind of like a little morbid, no pun intended, but it is. And the Gemara actually gives like a blow-by-blow, again, no pun intended, in Avodah Zarah as to what is the death process. So the Gemara says that what happens when a person dies, the first thing is, when the angel of death shows up, he shows up with, I guess, a gazillion iPads, or maybe just eyes. He's got this like giant ball made out of living eyeballs. And when he comes in, like it says, don't go after your heart and your eyes. So when he comes in with this giant ball of living eyeballs, so most of our first reaction would be like, whoa! Right? So as soon as we open our mouth, at that moment in Hara, the angel of death, it says, comes close, stands by the person's pillow, he draws his sword, and on the end of his sword is a bitter drop that goes into the person's mouth. And when that drop goes in, that's what brings the soul to come out. The Gemara Bracha said there are actually 903 different ways or different types of death. And it says that the worst, most difficult form of death is used as an analogy of an inverted thorn being pulled through cotton. And the highest, most gentle, what's called a neshika form of death, is called an eyelash being whisked out of milk. It's interesting too, it's kind of a black-white analogy in both of them. And of course, as the Maharsha explains there, this is talking about the soul and the body. We know that the soul sits inside the body on 13 basic meridians at 613 points. And every time a person does a mitzvah with that aspect of their body and soul, then the soul sits inside the body like a hand in a glove. So when the soul is extracted, it comes out like a hand from the glove. If not, then each time, God forbid, it's used for, let's say, a negative event, then the soul and the body become knotted. Now, if the person does tshuva while they are alive, the knot's undone. That's tshuva. But if not, chas v'shalom, then the only way that the soul can be removed from the body is through decomposition, which is why we have in Jewish law the idea that the body has to be put into the earth so that the body can actually decompose, because when that part of the body no longer exists, the soul is now free to return to where it goes. And this is why an interesting thing also, the Gemara in Moed Katan says, when the angel of death comes on collection day, nobody is considered important. You know, I remember like in the 60s or 70s, there was a T-shirt going on when I was in New York, and it said, "The person with the most amount of things when he dies wins." Right? Kind of like the world we live in today. Like, how can you make more money? And right. So then somebody came out with a T-shirt and said, the person with the most amount of things when he dies still dies," which I thought was a very appropriate response in terms of the T-shirt. And you know, at the end of the day, I'll tell you, there was a big Makubal in Sfat, Rebbe Leifer, who once told me, we say in our prayer, unless it's vodka, that Rash Gadol, a loud or big noise. So the numerical value of the word Rash Gadol is 613. That the only thing that makes noise upstairs is when we're doing acts of kindness, talking sweet to each other, when we're learning Torah, and that makes the noise. Otherwise, all the noise that we hear down here, it's just noise. It's not really wisdom that's necessarily being shared or moved forward. So the Gemara says that not only does a person die in their own time, but even in their own place. Gemara in Sukkot tells a story about King Solomon, who was also a very good friend of the angel of death. He once came into his palace near the Beit HaMikdash, and he saw that like the angel of death was bummed out. It's kind of like a funny visual if you want, right? So he says, "Yo, death baby, like what's happening? You know, bad hair day?" And he says, "No, you know what? There were these two guys. I was on dispatch, right, to go and collect. And the problem is they have to die in such and such a place. And I don't know how to get them there." And he mentions the name to King Solomon, and King Solomon says, "Well, you know, hey, we all have it tough." And he walks out and then, pew! He quickly runs over to these two guys and says, "Quick! There's a place that used to exist called Luz, which we would call a Shangri-La, where people never die." And he says to these two guys, "Look, I just saw the angel of death. Your name's on his ticket. You got to get out of here. Quickly go to Luz." Next day he comes in, he sees the angel of death. He's all like bubbly, you know, death kind of like. And he says, "Hey, what happened?" He says, "Oh, remember those two guys? Well, they had to die at the entrance to Luz. I had no idea how I was ever going to get them there. You won't believe what happened." Anyhow, so the Gemara, this is a story of the Gemara. So this is a Gemara which illustrates that there's even an idea of place. And what about attitude when death? So the Gemara says it's a bad sign to die crying, but it's a very good sign to die laughing. Another means like die of laughter, or die laughing. That's the Gemara in Baba Basra, but the Gemara also in another daf says, it's the Gemara in Kesuvos. The Gemara Baba Basra says, "Yet nobody jokes around on their last hour of life." Right? That's the sober moment. When Rebbe Elazar died, it said that the last word he said was Tohar, because that reflected his beauty and the way that he lived in the world. And of course, there's another Gemara which, if anybody here saw, if you're not really feeling old, all these like references, but there's some of you guys who can help me out here. If you ever saw the movie Big Lebowski, the dude, okay, so remember the famous of the famous when they cremate their buddy and they're standing on the cliff by the Pacific and they throw the ashes and the wind comes right back like just with all the ashes on. So actually it's a Gemara. So, and a lot of like religious writers out there in LA, so you never know like what the guys are like stealing stuff from the Gemara and putting it into like Shrek and all the rest of it. But anyhow, so the Gemara there says, what do you do if a person is holding an urn with the ashes of somebody and it breaks on the floor? Right? Practical question. You know, just ask your rabbi what he's supposed to do. Which I kind of find, which is not tonight's class, goes into the whole interesting of cremation. It's a very interesting concept. This was not, I mean, if you understand about the Sanhedrin grave tombs and many, they used to actually leave the bodies out until the flesh was off of them. They only had the bones, and the bones were put in the caskets. I don't know if you ever spent time at the Rambam's grave, but you know, you go to the Rambam, and then you have even bigger than the Rambam, but nobody notices that, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and Ami, Ramasi, and then you went down there, and you're Shalah at the very, and then there's one little thing, and it's like bones of random people, right? That's kind of like my favorite of all of them, like the bones of random people. But this is just sort of interesting to see that it comes out. Okay, part 3, coming to the next world. The Gemara says when a child is born in its womb, there are actually many Gemaras like this, but this one, it speaks specifically about what God invests in the child. It brings the Ruach, the spirit, the Neshama, the soul, the light of the face, eyesight, hearing, speech, movement, and 3 levels of wisdom, Chachma, Bina, Das. Right? So think about this for a minute. This is really important because I know before I learned this Gemara, I used to think of death like a Pez candy dispenser. You know, you can pop it open and your soul pops out, and it's like a little smoke that goes up. No, it's not like that at all. According to this Gemara, it says that all of those attributes stay with a person after they're dead. So you still have movement, you still have hearing, you still can speak, you still have sight, you have 3 levels of wisdom, means your cognitive intelligence is there as well, and the light of your face, which is what distinguishes, Portzaf we refer to it, the distinguishing element that you recognize people with, right? Face recognition, if you will. All of these things stay with you even after a person sheds their body, which is why it's very interesting, because this is one of my favorite Gemaras in Moed Katan. The Gemara says that there were 2 rabbis who died at the same time, and there were 2 camels bringing them in caskets coming up from Belleville. And all of a sudden it came to a very narrow bridge, and the camels wouldn't move. And they realized the reason the camels wouldn't move is because the 2 rabbis were arguing between their caskets. No, you first. No, you first. Right? And that's why, until the Gemara talks about an Arab who came and resolved the situation, but that doesn't matter. But the point is, they were still communicating and still dying. In fact, one of the ways I understand the Maharal, which I'm not sure anyone else does in the same way, but I'll share with you, when he says that Yaakov didn't die, right? Yaakov was embalmed. That's like pretty dead. Maybe that's like where the term mummy comes from. But like, it says he was embalmed. What do you mean he didn't die? So and the way the Maharal, I understand at least, is like a guy wakes up one morning dead, and he like goes over to the front door, but whoa, check that out, my arm went right through the door, and looks back and sees his body over there. Wow, he must have died. There was no death. It was just like going from one room to another room, kissing the mezuzah. It was going from one world to the next world. There was no death. It was movement. It was progression. There was no dying. Yaakov didn't die, because Yaakov was as he is, as we'll see later in the Gemara as well. So this idea as well, that by then the rabbi is, okay, yeah, we're dead, but that doesn't mean we can't still argue in halacha as to which person goes before the other person. And then we have also the famous story when Reb Huna died. They wanted to bury him in the cemetery of Reb Chia with his 2 sons. And they had to have a lottery who would even bring the casket in there, because they were all terrified to go in. But the one guy who got the job goes in, and when he comes in, suddenly Reb Chia they're dead hundreds of years, Reb Chia to Reb Huna. Reb Chia was like with Rebbe, and Reb Huna was a later Amorora, so at least a couple of hundred years. But they're talking, Reb Chia and his sons, and he says to his sons, hey, why don't you get up and move out of the way for Reb Huna? I mean, this was like the way our Chazal relate to this idea of the transition. That it's not the transition we actually think of. In fact, the Gemara goes even further. I find this very beautiful. If you really play your cards right in this world, and it's not that hard. If you just like lose the ego thing. Actually, somebody once told me ego stands for the 3 words, edging God out. So if you don't edge God out, so the Gemara says that God welcomes the souls of the righteous to the next world like welcoming a bride. It's a very beautiful type of an image. And the Gemara Moed Katan adds to that, it says, mourn for the mourners, but not for the dead, because the mourners are the one who have lost. But the dead have gained, because they are in a much better place. The Talmud says that in certain deaths, at the moment of great tzaddikim, incredible supernatural events occurred, like rain in Jerusalem in April. I'm not sure. But they give columns of fire in the street that were, columns in the streets that were shedding water, gutters overflowing with blood, stars that could be seen in the middle of the day, trees in a city becoming completely uprooted, firing stones from heaven, palm trees growing thorns. Again, these are all metaphor and very deep ideas, and each one needs to be studied, but it shows this idea of spiritual, physical, and its impact. The Gemara says that a righteous person is kept beneath God's throne, while the soul of the evil people are tossed between 2 angels from one end of the universe and the other. I think this is appropriate when you get the Arba Banim, the Rasha, the evil son. I hate that word evil, but the evil son, it really, the word Rasha comes from the word Rash, noise. There's just a lot of confusion. There's a lot of noise. Nobody's a Rasha. You know, we're all tzaddikim, but we just sometimes lose touch with our holiness. And why? Because we have Rash in our head. Rasha is Rash. And so therefore, that problem of having noise in our head means we can't stand still. We can't be focused. The tzaddik, his soul, her soul, finds a place right under God's throne. But the soul, which is always in turmoil, it remains in turmoil. Thus the symbolism of being tossed between the 2 angels. The Gemara also says that a righteous person in the next world is greeted by 3 angels, and an evil person is greeted by 3 hell's angels. And then the last thing on this subject is an amazing word, Chagiga. It's also the Zohar brings it, but it says that, as we all know, when Yosef announced to his brothers, he says, Ani Yosef, they were flabbergasted, to say the least. But the Zohar and the Gemara Chagiga says, that's nothing. Because it's after a person dies in the next world, the first thing they hear is, I am God. And that's when the soul is like shaken. In fact, the Shalah brings this idea of saying a certain pasuk 3 times at the end of Yeshmon Esrei and so on, because at that moment a person won't even know what their name is, and that's just sort of like a little tool that he says. Okay, next section. Do the dead even care about the living? So the Gemara begins by asking a question, at what point do the dead stop listening to what the living say? Which is an interesting thing, because you think they're dead, they don't listen. But no, we've already proved that's not the case here. So the Gemara has a discussion. Is it the closing of the coffin, or is it at the moment when the body is decomposed? The Gemara says, however, for the first 12 months after death, the soul travels between heaven and earth. And we know that the first place the soul goes after death is to where it lived, which is where the custom of covering the mirrors and reflection is, because what happens is the soul comes in and looks in the mirror and there's nobody there. So that's very frightening. I imagine the only thing more frightening than that would be to come in and everyone's like breaking out the whiskey. Yeah, let's see what the will's got, as opposed to, sitting shiva and mourning and so on. So when a person mourns and there's mourning in the shiva, then the shama, actually the soul, can mourn together with them. Then it says at that point, after the 7 days, there's a resolution that the person really realizes that they're dead. And at that point, the soul begins to become lighter than air and leave. And the Zohar writes about this at length. If you ever read the books of Dr. Moody, anybody know Dr. Moody? Ooh, put him on your must-read list. Dr. Moody's a scientist who's traveled all around the world interviewing people who've had near-death experiences. And he shows the incredible, phenomenal common denominators. The only problem is there's never been anybody who's been more than, except the movie Flatline, right? Who's been more than a certain point dead, where the Zohar picks up where that leaves off. So the Zohar talks about a time where the soul is now moving and moving and moving to where it's like, it's looking, oh yeah, I'm the third rock from the sun. And then it gets to a certain point, which is the iyush, of giving up hope of ever, even if it could reverse the movement away and suddenly come back, it wouldn't even know how to find Earth. Even a GPS, so maybe it's like a God positioning system. But otherwise, it would never find its way back. And at that moment, when it gives up coming back, it does what's called the turning around. Instead of facing Ki'ilu, the earth going away, it turns around, and that's when it experiences Ani Hashem. And that's and in fact, I don't go too much down that road, but in that point, there is what the person experiences as this absolutely unbelievable, mind-boggling angel. Now, the bad news about that angel is it really is absolutely amazing, boggling angel. It really is, but that's the good news. The bad news, it's you. Because what that angel is God says, when I made you, this is what I had in mind. Now let's see what you did with it. And that becomes the process of judgment and all the rest, is that contrast. And that's why it says Yaakov never died. Because what that angel looked like and what Yaakov looked like was one and the same. Because he was himself. And by being his true self, he lived that which God had in mind for him to live. Here's I'm going to skip a few here just in the interest of time, but this I can't skip. This is, again, I put this on one of the all-time greatest Gemaras in Shas, which is, if you didn't love Talmud already, this should definitely do it. So one of the great Amoraim was Reb Nachman. Very heavy hitter, serious player, probably 320 MVP, right? Really up there. And he was like amazing, heavy rabbi. So the Gemara begins, if we're like doing a little video here, the Gemara begins out in the field. He has farm workers who are working. And as they're hoeing the ground, one of them puts the pitchfork in the ground, and out from under the ground comes, ow! And they're like, what? And they like run away, and they bring Reb Nachman. And Reb Nachman comes back, and he says, hello, hello, hello. And the voice comes back. I heard you. You don't have to keep yelling, right? And so the Gemara goes through this phenomenal conversation of this man who's 200 years dead before Reb Nachman, who's like, as they say in the yeshiva vernacular, like he's verhearing, he's testing Reb Nachman back and forth on Torah ideas, like, oh my gosh, you're a rabbi? Like, what? How far have we fallen since my generation? And like Reb Nachman is like, embarrassed by this unbelievable Talmud Chacham. So finally Reb Nachman, what do you do when you're talking to a dead person who's buried under the ground at your feet? Obviously you invite him and come into the house, a little kishka, some cholent, right? Have make a l'chaim, make a lamavas. I don't know what they make. Anyhow, so come on in. So he's like, he invites him, and then the guy says, boy, you really don't know anything about Torah, do you? I'm not allowed to get out of the grave. I have to remain here until HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us it's time for the coffins to open. Just an amazing. If you want to take a look at that, that's in Shabbat on 152b. Here's another amazing Gemara. Again, this is why I say that the Amoraim were such phenomenal Jews. They'd be in Cherem today, because here's the story of. You guys are a little familiar with learning here. I'm just going to throw this out. Have you ever heard of a guy named Abaya? Right? I don't even go for daf anywhere in Shas. Maybe Yerushalmi, but that's not fair. Without seeing his name, okay? So Abaya, right? Serious, major rabbi of the generation. He was personal friends with a magician grave robber. I don't know many Chassidish Rebbe's today who are like friends with grave robbers. So here's the story of a magician grave robber who was robbing graves. I mean, that's what he does, right? And as he's robbing graves, I guess obviously he had a beard. As he's robbing graves, one of the dead guys grabs him by the beard. So he's like stuck there, with his beard being held by this dead guy. And of course he has to, I guess, pull out his iPhone where they had in those days, like a little amulet, right? And he pulls an eye amulet. He pulls a little eye amulet and he calls Abaya, and Abaya comes running down. And the Gemara says, Abaya was able to finally convince the dead guy to let go of the beard. Now, you would think that this magician Chacham would learn his lesson. Gemara continues, right back, same thing, next year, robbing the grave, out comes the hand, out comes Abaya. Abaya can't convince him the second time. So the Gemara ends with Abaya running to get scissors to cut the beard to help the guy get out of the cemetery. Yeah, that's the Gemara in Baba Basra. Everybody knows this famous Gemara that after Rebbe died, the Gemara says that he would come back every Friday night and he would make Kiddush in his house. Which, because it's Rebbe, it's very believable. Because there's other stories of more contemporary great rabbis who died, and there's always the story, I don't remember who it was, but one Rebbe who died, and his son used to call his late father up to give him an aliyah to Torah, and you wouldn't hear anything. But the Rebbe, the living Rebbe, would say, Baruch Hu Shmo, Amen, right? And so I would say, when he gives him a Hadba, then I'll be in, right? But in the meantime, it's a little hard to, but for Rebbe, I could definitely believe it. So it says, Rebbe would come and make Kiddush, and then word came out, long story, you can go look up the Gemara yourself, but word came out that he was coming back from the dead, and he stopped coming back. Now, why did he stop coming back? This shows you that the soul lives on. If you are a beautiful soul in this world, you will be a beautiful soul forever. The reason he didn't come back was not because he was busted. He didn't come back because now that people knew that he could come back, he didn't want to embarrass the other righteous people who had died who were not able to come back, because it would make them look bad. So here he was worried about embarrassing dead people, that they wouldn't be seen in the same light because they didn't have that same ability to come back to their families. So the next thing I just want to share one more on this particular subject here. It says, when Rebbe Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon died, so before he was buried next to his father Marom, the Gemara says he was buried, or he was laid to rest in an attic in the house. And for 14 years he lied there. And during those 14 years, people would come outside the house and they would yell up questions, and a voice would come out. And finally, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai had to come back from the dead and demand that his son be buried with him in Marom. And the townspeople tried to fight that he would not be allowed to leave, because they said that for the 14 years that he was up there, never once did a dangerous animal enter their city. That even there, the Shmirah, the protection, the real Iron Dome of the greatness of righteousness was still alive even when the man had quote-unquote died. So the next section, Judgment Day. The Gemara says there are three people who do not come out of hell. One of them is somebody who embarrasses another person. Another one who is somebody who has a relationship with a married woman. And the third one is somebody who routinely calls somebody by a bad nickname. And of course, the Gemara qualifies, this is all if the person, God forbid, did not do tshuva while they were still alive in this world. The Gemara also elsewhere talks about the 6 questions. So if you want to start cramming now, right? The 6 questions that a person are asked in heaven. They're lined up according to the 6 orders of the Talmud. But nonetheless, the very first one, which I find extremely beautiful, is, and if you ever want to play trivia with people, you can say, okay, according to Judaism, what's the first question they ask you in heaven? Most people say, did you believe in God? Did you keep Shabbat? Did you, right? No. Were you honest in business? Pretty powerful. Because the truth of the matter is, if you're really honest in business, especially like if there's no video camera watching you or nobody sees, right? But you really are, because you really are aware of God 24/7 everywhere, then that means you really are a religious person. How well you function on the rest of your religiosity? Okay, I always love, my favorite line is, don't ever judge another person because he sins differently than you, right? So who are we to judge? But at least in the core, if we're honest and it reflects ourselves and honest in business, this is a very heavy thing. We're not going to go through the other 6 right now, but we will say the conclusion of the Gemara is, despite all 6 of them, the Gemara says the most important thing is, did a person have irei shamayim, fear of heaven? Now, I got to take a moment on this word, fear of heaven. Fear of heaven means, yes, fear of heaven, as in, i.e., spooked. That's what it really means. It really means that. It means it's not beneath us. It's not like for little kids in cheder. It's really the highest. Reshet Hachma Irat Hashem. It's the highest. Because Ira is connected to Riyah, to see. When you really see, not what you see, but what you see, when you really see, then you begin to realize how absolutely small we are. And how unbelievably big God is. And how unbelievable our history is. And how even more incredible our future is. And how while we must do what we must do, we understand it's God who runs the world and our lives. And when we humble ourselves like this, which is what Moshe, it doesn't say that Moshe had like an IQ of 400 million to the 20th power. Maybe he did, right? Moshe was the humblest of all people. Because the lower you can go, the higher you will rise. That's the irony. As Reb Soloveitchik says, do not call it the Garden of Paradise, call it the Garden of Paradox. Paradox in a human spiritual development is, if you want to go up, you've got to go down. By becoming humble, a person will be risen by in heaven. So the Gemara says on the tail of that, in Krisos, it says that only God knows how God will tip the scales. None of us know how the judgment system actually works. The Gemara also says, excuse me, it says that even though people will cry on their way to hell, right? Hell is the passageway to heaven. At the same time, they will praise God for His just sentence. That's the Gemara in Eruvin, which I always say, one thing you'll never hear in hell is, I want my lawyer. Probably because he's standing right next to you. But chances are, the reason you're not, the reason you're not going to ask for your lawyer in hell is because hell, you see, okay, there's some people who say like this, there's heaven, there's earth, and under earth is hell. And so it's kind of like a fight, right? Like, I don't know, Samsung versus Apple for the market share, right? So heaven's trying to get heaven, and hell's trying to get them to hell. No, we don't see it like that at all. The hierarchy in Judaism is heaven, hell, and the lowest is earth. Why? Because it's not based upon pleasure, it's based upon wisdom. Earth is the only place in the universe where you could not know God. And this is the biggest gift we have. The most amazing gift we have is that we live within a certain time period where you could not know God. Because there's nowhere else in creation you cannot know God. Only here. This is it. And therefore, if you can crack that riddle and get that little golden ring out of the pig's nose as you're on the carousel, if you can manage that, you've got everything. As the Zohar says, when a person's born in this world, they're like a sun. But if you navigate it correctly, you go to the next world like a galaxy of light. It's all yours for the taking. It's all yours. But it's really hardball. And it's really a game of keeps. Right? There's no rehearsal to life. This is it. This is it. And it's happening every second. And so therefore, when we take this challenge, even in one breath, the very last breath of a person's life, they can acquire everything. So when we take this challenge, the magic of the challenge is to realize that in our power of having this free will, we can actually supersede death. Because, as the Gemara says, the evil people are dead while they are living, but the righteous people never die. Because they just change form. That's all. They just go from one room, kiss the mezuzah, to the next room. That's all it is. And they elevate and they continue to grow. They grow infinitely. And that's the miracle that we have in front of us. The obstacle, of course, to that is when we realize in hell, or not the obstacle, the result if we don't realize that. So in hell, there's total God consciousness, and everything that's happening that might be uncomfortable, it's all just. Because we understand how each thing that's happening is a tikkun, it's a healing. It's all about healing. And therefore it's a healing process. Obviously the highest level, which is a heavenly level, is to be in a state of peace with knowledge, as opposed to a state of conflict with knowledge. And the worst is to be without knowledge, which is what this world is about. This is why the Gemara also says there's 7 names for hell, each one representing a different level or darker level of darkness, but it means a hell in this world where we lose that sight of where we could be. Nonetheless, the Gemara says that Avram Avinu stands at the entrance of hell, and he saves everyone who passes through if they've done tshuva while they were still alive in this world. And the Gemara says this, I find a very beautiful Gemara. I want to drill on that for a minute. One of my other awesome heroes of all heroes, 2 of the greatest Amoraim, Abaya and Reb Yochanan, although one was slightly ahead of the other in terms chronological, they both had the experience that their father died before their mother gave birth. Their mothers both died at childbirth. And Reb Yochanan was actually raised by his grandfather. So Yerushalmi talks about Reb Yochanan's grandfather used to carry Reb Yochanan on his shoulder, and he would hear all of the great Tanoim and so on. But the point is, here you've got Reb Yochanan. Hundreds plus years earlier was a man named Rebbe Meir who had a chaver / Rebbe named Acher. Acher dies. Acher is such a bad guy that already several hundred years later, there's still smoke coming out of his grave in Tiberias. And Rabbi Yochanan says, is this how you honor your student, your Rebbe? That he's buried and hundreds of years later, there's still a hellfire coming out of his grave? So the Gemara says when Rabbi Yochanan died, and Acher wasn't even his Rebbe or whatever, the Gemara says when he died, he went into hell. He went to hell to find Acher and to pull him out. And the people, the Gemara says that when they saw, the angels of hell saw Rabbi Yochanan, they were so frightened of Rabbi Yochanan that nobody stood in his way. But it's an amazing idea. We all fear the idea of going to hell. Imagine if you could go to hell to do something positive to help somebody else. What an idea. In fact, this is the Gera Rebbe, the Sfat Emet, how he learns Gemara in Brachot. It says that, forgive me, doctors are the first to hell. A good doctor is first to hell. So how does the Gera Rebbe mean it? There are many, many explanations. The Gera Rebbe explains that when a person's in pain, they're in hell. And a good doctor will run to take care of him. So when there's a person in hell, the good doctor is the first one. Imagine being a good soul doctor, right? To be able to run into hell and to help people out. Just an amazing idea of where these people were at. Anyhow, just quickly here, because we don't want to finish this up, the Gemara says that nobody will be able to justify or excuse their shortcomings or their failure to reach their potential when they stand before God on the day of judgment. A liar will never be able to stand before God in the next world. Our own actions will interview us, and we will sign a testimony that everything claimed against us is correct. And yet, on the other hand, every mitzvah and every good deed one does in this world will testify for him and her in the next world. Here are 3 people who do not go to hell. It's another Gemara. It says a poor person, a person who suffered from stomach illness, and someone who was hassled by the government or debtors. And there's a Yeshomri that says also a person who lived with a bad spouse. So I'm sure a couple of us can check a few of those off. So the Gemara in Yevamos says those who experience the test of poverty and those who truly fear God are removed from hell. Reish Lakish says, and this is a famous Gemara which I want to explain according to Nachman Kahana, this says that the person, even the evil people or the Rishoyim are protected from the fire of hell because they are filled with mitzvot. Like I think we said this in the last class. Yeah? Like did we talk about the pomegranate? No. So yeah, and so Nachman says a very beautiful thing. If you open up a pomegranate, first of all, it doesn't have 613 seeds, so forget that. But what you will find is that the seeds are in compartments. And the whole idea of performing mitzvot is to create unity. They're all to be, like the Rambam says, there's 613 outer mitzvot, and the spikes come the 10 commandments, and the hub is Anochi Hashem. So every commandment is to bring to Anochi Hashem, to know God. That's K-N-O-W, to know God. And therefore, when a person is coming to there, it creates unity. The Rasha also does good deeds, but they're compartmentalized. They don't have that sense of unity. That's at least how he explained the Gemara. Just a few more things here. It says that a person who does tshuva in this world from their ego will jump into the next world like the Avot did. And this is through the power of kol. Ba kol, mi kol, kol. I'm not going to go into that. That's the Kabbalah class, starts at midnight. But through that power of kol, the soul jumps. And those of you who are familiar know that the language of jumping is the language of angels. Angels jump, they don't walk. So therefore, a person dies, he becomes on that level. And that's why the Gemara of Avodah Zorah says that if a person truly dies, when he goes to the next world, he's called rabbi, or maybe Rebbitzin, I don't know. But that's the term that's used to address them. Has anyone ever died and come back? Well, the Ramban writes a very beautiful story. He had asked somebody on his deathbed to please ask God or the angel something, come back and give him the answer. Meanwhile, weeks had gone by, the guy's like long dead, right? And, sorry, I just actually had my son's yard site was a couple of weeks ago, so like death is sort of like a lot on my mind as well now. And I always find that one of the things about being dead is you always think like, when you get like bored after a while, okay, I got it, you're dead, okay, hello, you can come back now, it's like kind of cool. Anyhow, so the eternalness of it, which is awkward. But anyhow, so this guy doesn't come back. So the Ramban, the Ramban's writers say that he went to find the guy, and he goes, oh yeah, sorry, it's so unbelievable here, I completely forgot there was even a place called Earth. It says when Rava, it's two different stories, but they parallel. When Rava and Nachman were both on their deathbed, and they saw the angel of death coming, they quickly turned to their friends and said, please make sure that the angel doesn't hurt me when I die. That is Rava and Rav Nachman. And then one of his friends said, okay, but will you come back after you die and tell me what it was like to die? And so the Gemara says that Rav Nachman came back and he said, and I quote from the Gemara Moed Katan, if God had asked him, meaning Rav Nachman, if God had asked me to come back to life and continuing living to die another day, I would not want to from the fear of the angel of death. And here is the most classic of all Gemara. It appears twice in Shas, but I like the one in Psachim because there's a problem with a girsa in the other source. I remember it's Baba Batra. But in Psachim it's clear that Reb Yosef, the son of Yeshua ben Levi, dies and comes back to life. And when he comes back to life, Reb Yeshua says to him, he said, what did you see in the world upstairs? And he said, all of the big machers in this world, totally insignificant. All the little people like selling, nuts in the shuk that we don't even notice, they're the guys on the big golden thrones. They're the ones that really God loves. And then Yeshua says to them, and what were we like? Now think about this. This is the craziest question in the world. What do you mean, what were we like? What were we like in the next world? Hello, we're still here. What do you mean, what were we like? How can you even ask the question? And even more amazing, he answers it. He says, just like we are here. Now there's a very deep idea here. We, because we're very locked into linear concept of time, think that time is linear. No, it's not. It's just how we function in time. It's not linear in the least. That's why Yud-K Vav-K means now. Then, was, will be. It's all now. There's no then by God. It's only now. So therefore, time is not linear. Just our approach to time is linear. So therefore, what he was really saying is when we talk about Olam Haba, we think of it on a linear line. Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba, to come, the one to come. But it's really not like that. It's sequential. It's in the same line, if you will. So we are simultaneously already in Olam Haba, even as we are in Olam Hazeh. Because by God, we've already died and we were never born. Right? It's all in oneness. So therefore, when he came to the Olam Emet, where there was no longer linear time, even though from his chronological point of view they hadn't died yet, but now that he was in that realm of time, he could move it to the now. So therefore what he was saying is, as we are now, if we are straight, right, because a Yashrei Lev is higher than a Tzaddik. Take a look at the last Rashi in the end of the first parak in Tainat to see an amazing mind-blowing that a person who has straight heart is higher and holier than a Tzaddik. And therefore, because we are straight in this world, we are also straight in the last world. And let's just conclude on a few last points here. The good news is, everybody comes back from the dead. So, there's a story, they say by Rabbi Akiva Eger. There was a very bad man who charged exorbitant interest on loans. And when he died, the Hever Kadisha, the burial society, really wanted to stick it to the family. So they like upsold everything. You know, it was like mahogany wood caskets and, you know, all this. I remember actually my father died. So we're in the funeral home in Long Island, and my brother's with me. And the guy's saying, well, you want this kind of casket, right? Or you want this, and you want that. And my brother said, listen, you know, I'm sorry, it's like the first time our dads ever died. Maybe you could like walk me through it a little bit, right? Anyhow, so they're like upping the bill and upping the bill and upping the bill. And so finally, the family sues the Chevra Kadisha in the Bet Din. And Rabbi Akiva Eger was the Av Bet Din. And he votes on the side of the Chevra Kadisha. He says, listen, I want to tell you something. Why do Jews have flimsy little caskets and it's no big deal? Because they're rentals. Everyone's coming back. He's not coming back. So he's buying. He needs a nice home, right? That was his, because, you know, repeat is not necessarily high on the list. But except for that, we all come back. And that's really the amazing and the good news. And so while we are alive, the Gemara in Eruvin says, this is a little heavy, but I guess the material probably was heavy. The Gemara says a person should train themselves to accept death at the hand of God graciously. And I think the only way that we can do that, especially when it comes to our own death, is to really, 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 really realize it's all been a gift. We didn't pay for it. How much do you pay for your respiratory system? How much do you pay for your vascular system? How much do you pay for the air you breathe? I mean, it's a gift. It's all a gift. It's an amazing gift from God. And when it's the time to go back home, it's the time to go back home. And it's only the ego that fights and resists, because that's the one that thinks we live forever. But the human that realizes that we're mortal will convert every day of his or her life into a sacred moment. Anger will go away. Because how could you be angry? What's there to be angry about? You know, worry goes away. I mean, we hold on to worry because it's part of our personality. What if we didn't worry? Right? What if we really trusted God? What if we really had that faith, not intellectually, but emotionally, in our spirit, in our soul? That's what our opportunity of life is, and that's really our greatest gift. Rebbe Eliezer on his deathbed said, how do you want to go to heaven? Be careful with your friend's honor, bring your children to learn wisdom, and know who you stand before when you pray. Rabbi Yochanan's famous line, everybody knows, when he died, he said, may you fear God at least as much as other people. And all the students said, what? Only that? He said, halavai, just that. Halavai, the same way we fear our boss or whatever, we should have at least that fear when it comes to our standing before God. And the Gemara says that it's important to encourage a person on their deathbed to repent, to do tshuva. Because there's nothing that will come more to the defense of a person in the next world than tshuva and good deeds. And every act of tshuva, as we saw earlier, the Gemara repeats it here as well, will bring and create an angel that will stand in his defense. And the Gemara in Shabbos concludes, amazing language. Look it up. It's a 32a in Gemara in Shabbat. It says there that when a person is being judged in the next world, even if there are 999 angels that are all going like that, toast them, toast them, toast them, and one angel speaks up good, that's it. God will save him on behalf of just that one angel. The Gemara also says that jealousy in the heart is a horrible thing, causes the bones to rot in the grave. But the point of the Gemara is a person should strive to give back a clean soul in the same way that they received it when they came here. And the last thing I want to end in Gemara Chagiga, the Gemara asks, why are the words of the Torah compared to a cattle prod? Right, a lot of analogies of the words of Torah, but why a cattle prod? Cattle prod is not pleasant. And it says, yeah, it's not pleasant, but the idea of the cattle prod is to save you from the path of life. From the path of death, that we should move on the path of life. And I'll end it with a very beautiful, our Chazal tell us, when we know when the giving of the Torah, the first 2 commandments, actually all 10 commandments they heard, but the first 2 were understandable, but it was a miracle because they were simultaneous and so on. And the Gemara says a certain amount of people actually died, and a certain amount of people were, this is probably where the turn came from, blown away. The angels had to lift them up and bring them back. And the people who were dead had to come back to life. Now, when that happened, they said to Moshe, they said, whoa, this is like heavy stuff. There's 613 of these. We just died on the first one. I die, and die. What if one of the times we don't come? 253, he died, didn't come back. So they said, maybe the Torah that you're getting, this is like a tree of death. And this is where the expression Moshe says, no, it's Eitz Chayim Hi. It's a tree of life. because you cannot die if you hold on to this tree. You may lose your corporal sense of the moment, but guess what? I mean, anybody look in a mirror lately? Do you still look like you looked when you were 17? I know. So everything changes. Nothing is staying the same. What's stagnant in this world, except for like bad smelling water and ponds? What's stagnant? Nothing. It's all moving. It's all going forward. You're still alive. You're alive like you were 17. Maybe different skill sets, but you may be hopefully more wiser. I always say there's two ways to get older. You either age or you sage. So as you become wiser in life, you're into a different phase of your life. And therefore, once you leave this world and go to the next world, you're in the awesome phase of your life. But it's living. And when you hold on to Torah, because of its connection to God and when it permeates in this world, this is our opportunity to be able to conquer death in our lives. Thank you very much, and Chag Sameach.